My lecture this morning is advertised as Macroeconomics of Taxes and Tax Reform, and I added to the title page just this morning, Federal Budget Deficits. For truth in advertising, there's quite a bit about deficits too that are related obviously to tax issues. And I say macroeconomics. I think I'm a force of habit. I'm a macroeconomist, but what I'll have to say this morning has a good bit of micro in it as well. I might start by mentioning one of my favorite books. I like the spirit of it. A book by Franz Oppenheimer called The State. And he has a particular view of taxes that you can't help but warm up to. And it goes something like this. He says there are two methods of acquiring wealth. And one is production and exchange. And he refers to that as the economic means. And the other method is confiscation and threat of violence. You know, that can work too. And he calls that the political means. And then he defines government as the organization of the political means. Now, that plays to a crowd of extreme libertarians, anarchists, and so on. And if we took that view in this lecture, the lecture would be pretty short and sweet, wouldn't it? You know, taxation, it's theft, it's immoral, we're against it, end of story. That would be it. But that's not what I want to do. I want to look at taxes as they're collected today, look at government spending, look at deficits, and see what we can say about what's the worst of it and where to make improvements at the margin. That at least gives the economist something to say. First, just to show you that we do have something to talk about, I want to look at the time series on several of these magnitudes that fortunately are readily available through the St. Louis Fed. It's a great source of data. You can find data on money supply and taxes and expenditures and so on. And first I'll show you government spending. You're not surprised to see which direction it's going. And I could have shown you a chart that adjusts for inflation, or a chart that compares to GDP, which would be a little less upward sloping than the one you see. But my purpose is to show how this relates to taxes. So I'm going to show taxes as well, and we'll get an idea of the fiscal situation, including, of course, the deficit. So spending is onward and upward with a particularly sharp rise in this century. If you look at taxes, it looks a little different. You get the rise, the general rise, but you see a jog there at around 2000, and that's due to two things. One is the recession that we had at the end of the Clinton expansion. Well, okay, that's the Austrian business cycle playing itself out, but when the economy turned down, as it did even before the terrorist attack, that also reduced tax revenue. The terrorist attack itself, of course, made things worse in that respect. But the second thing, of course, is the Bush tax cuts, which, of course, are coupled with deficit increases, because, as you already saw, he didn't cut government spending. And so that's what taxes look like. And then the next one shows deficits, which takes a little explaining, because you'd think that deficits might not have that sharp spike there right before the turn of the century. And it turns out that part of that spike, but only part of it, is again due to the Clinton expansion. If you press the economy beyond its sustainable level, you do generate a lot of income, a lot of output, and that's what taxes are based on. And so you get increased tax revenue that at least make the deficit lower, if not give you a surplus. But the reason that you actually see the increase above the zero line, in other words, the so-called Clinton surplus, is due more to creative accounting than it is to any macroeconomic effect. There's a lot written about this, with Clinton having a way of drawing funds from the Social Security fund and replacing and putting in the fund instead of what was called unmarketable IOUs, which didn't show up in the deficit. That was the key strategy to doing that, and he was well aware, I think, of what he was doing. The unmarketable IOUs are something very similar to the way you deal with your office's coffee room, where you have a little jar or something that you're supposed to drop a quarter in when you give a cup of coffee. And if your department or your office is anything like ours, you'll also see little pieces of paper in there that says, I owe you 25 cents. It's not signed by anybody and so on. You know. But that's essentially the way Clinton achieved that particular surplus, as he called it. In fact, you're suspicious that it wasn't a surplus when you look at the accumulated debt, which is just an accrual of deficits over the years. And if there really was a surplus, then that debt should have a negative slope at some point. Well, it doesn't. Okay, it doesn't. So that's a better reckoning, I think. But once again, you see the little kink around 2000, which has a double explanation. It became close to horizontal at the end of the Clinton expansion because tax revenues were up, and it increased sharply because of the recession and because of the Bush tax cuts. And I show here also the international trade deficit, which will come into play later in my lecture. And you can see it has a pretty distinct movement in it too. It's done some jiggling there at the end. The last movement was in the downward direction, as you can probably see. The last data point shows that, so I suspect it's going to go down even further. And if you ask Austrians about the trade deficit, you'll learn pretty quickly that it's not necessarily a bad thing in its own right. It can simply mean that people in other countries prefer to invest in our economy rather than their own, possibly because this economy is more stable than those other countries. A large part of the 1800s involved some pretty heavy international trade deficits as France and other countries invested in the U.S., which was to their gain and ours. International trade's a good thing, but it can show up as a trade deficit if the funds flowing in are used for investment purposes. Although having said that, this trade deficit is largely due to the government borrowing. In other words, it's not that the foreigners are making it possible to invest more in this country, but making it possible for the government to borrow more and spend without collecting taxes. So that it can be a reflection of that, and I think in this case it is. More about that later in the lectures. Let me give you just a brief overview of the things I want to talk about today. I do have, maybe before I even show you the short list of questions I'm trying to answer, I do have a whole chapter in my Time and Money about fiscal issues, and that came to mind when just recently I saw an excerpt from a new book by Brian Doherty of Reason magazine. That's a book on the libertarian movement in America, and he has some critical remarks about the Austrians. And one of his critical remarks is that they never write about fiscal issues. I don't know just where that comes from. Well, they do, and I think what the perception is that the Austrians write so much about monetary issues and the business cycle issues, and that looms so large in the Austrian literature that what they do write about fiscal issues, taxation, and so on gets lost. But it's not lost in my Time and Money. It's chapter 5, I think. It's called Fiscal Issues. Okay, it's there. Now, what I want to deal with today is several questions. One, does the tax take measure the burden of government? Secondly, are all taxes dollar for dollar equally harmful? this is something we're interested in. We want to find out about it. We don't want to take an Oppenheimer view, even if that's the general spirit of our attitude towards taxation. Some are worse than others. Are taxes better or worse than budget deficits? And here I'm going to give you a view that differs from, say, the monetarists, or differs from mainstream economists. Whether you call it an Austrian view, I'm not sure. It's my view. But maybe that'd be a point of discussion. What's the case for a flat tax? That's a topic that has come up in the last several elections. Steve Forbes advocated a flat tax, or at least he called it flat. It turns out his wasn't very flat, which was one of his problems. We'll see about that. And finally, a consumption tax. Is it preferable to an income tax? And in the last several years, Neil Bortz has been a big advocate of a consumption tax, which he calls a fair tax. That's his particular name for his tax proposal, fair tax. But if you look at it in particulars, you see, well, okay, it's a consumption tax that he wants to replace the income tax with. So we'll start with question number one about the burden of government. There's some important issues here. And here I want to spot Friedman a point, although I'll quarrel with him on what he sees as a secondary point, and I don't think it is secondary. And what Friedman says is that government spending is a much better measure of the burden of government as compared to taxes. And he's thinking in real terms. In other words, government spending represents the amount of resources that the government manages to take command of, which leaves then that much less for use in the private sector. And okay, some of that spending is financed by taxes, but the rest of it is spending as well, and the government gets resources with that spending too. And so it doesn't matter as far as measuring the burden of taxes, just how the government got the money. They could have taxed it away, or they could have borrowed it and run a deficit. And so Friedman would say, well, government spending is taxes plus the government deficit, the budget deficit. But the taxes and the deficit are just two ways of financing spending, and it's spending that's the burden. And first I'll offer what I think of as a friendly amendment, and what I think Friedman himself would see as a friendly amendment. It comes from Dick Wagner, who says, well, even that understates the burden of government, because he would add to it regulation. The government, in a lot of senses, in fact, I'll mention one particular one in a minute, just because I think it's an interesting one, and it gives you the idea about how burdensome the regulations can be. But almost any kind of regulation would have an equivalent as a tax and spend policy. In other words, if the government wants a particular company or a particular industry to do such and such, it can just pass a regulation and say they have to do it. All right, even if it doesn't suit consumer preferences, they have to do it. That's the regulation. But alternatively, they could pay them to do it and get the funds by collecting taxes or borrowing. And the point that Wagner would make is that the burden of government is the same or similar, no matter which way the government goes. So you don't want to ignore the regulations when you consider the burden of government. And of course, if you even take a broader view, you could just have a long list of things that government does that is harmful, which would include regulation, trade policy, stabilization policy, and on and on. They all count as burdens, although some of them are more difficult to quantify than others. One of the burdens I want to talk about in regulation both illustrates the point and shows you how particularly burdensome government can be in this sense. And it has to do with fuel economy of the vehicles that we drive. Left to the market, you can anticipate what would happen, that the automakers certainly understand that people don't like to pay high gas prices. They want better mileage in their cars, and that's one feature of a car that consumers look at, and automakers will be sensitive to that and make their designs accordingly. Unfortunately, the government has a different idea about what fuel efficiency should be. And it could collect taxes and pay the automakers to make cars that had more fuel efficiency than the market itself would result in. It could do that, but it doesn't. It imposes regulation, and the regulation comes in the form of what are called the CAFE, C-A-F-E, the CAFE standards, which are particularly troublesome standard in a lot of different ways. CAFE, C-A-F-E, stands for Corporate Average Fuel Economy. Corporate Average Fuel Economy. And it's a very strange rule because it imposes an average fuel economy for all of the vehicles that a particular corporation produces. All right? So it's for the whole fleet of automobiles and vehicles of whatever kind. There is a distinction between cars on the one hand and trucks on the other. That cars have a higher fuel efficiency requirement than do trucks. That's the way the regulation works. But it's all done on an average basis among cars and an average basis among trucks. Now, can you predict what the consequences would be? It's really retrodicting because we've seen what the consequences would be. And that is that firms know they can satisfy customers, of course, by giving them the kind of vehicles they want. And they have to work around these requirements. Now, one of the ways they did it in the early years of CAFE requirements is that they recategorized some of their vehicles from cars to trucks so that they could produce bigger ones which were in demand by consumers. In fact, that explains the demise of the old station wagon. We used to have these wonderful big station wagons with wood paneling on the side. I know some people hate those, but those big station wagons were in demand, and people drove them, and I liked them. They were comfortable. They had a smooth ride and so on. But they didn't get great gas mileage. That wasn't one of their positive features. Well, some people were willing to spend the money on gas in order to drive those kinds of cars. But they virtually went out of existence in the early 90s precisely because of this requirement and the way that the car companies satisfied the demand for large vehicles that carry passengers, lots of passengers, and are comfortable, is they built them on truck frames. They said, well, we'll just put them on a truck frame and call them not a wagon, we'll call them sport SUV. We'll call them a sport ute. Okay, so the whole sport ute market was a result of reclassifying cars as trucks in order to be able to build bigger ones that didn't get quite the mileage that the cars got. And it also caused the automobile companies to make very small cars that almost nobody wanted. Like General Motors made one called the Chevette. You remember the Chevette? Little bitty car, but it got great gas mileage. And the idea was the GM could sell, if they sold enough of those cars, even if they cut the price down to where they could sell enough, that entitled them to build other cars that were bigger and but didn't get quite the good gas mileage, because what they had to comply with was an average mileage for the fleet. Okay, so you sell a bunch of small cars with good mileage to buy the permission to give to build large cars that got poorer mileage. That's not very efficient regulation. It's a burden on the economy, a burden on that market, probably more so than even a tax and spend policy. It's sort of an interesting epilogue to that story, which I've told for several years, I guess, is that things have changed in recent years such that, okay, people like sport utes. They like them better than the old wagons. Everybody drives a sport ute, and they want to sit up high and all that. And they want a big sport ute, not just an Explorer, but expedition or an excursion or Hummer. They like the big ones, and they like them so big that it became even more difficult for the car companies to meet the gas requirements on the trucks, even though they were higher, than on the cars, because people like big trucks, dualies and long wheelbase and four-door Cadillac trucks. Never understood that, but that's what they like now, And so now it's gone back the other way, where the automakers now are reclassifying trucks as cars. In the last few years, Ford, for instance, has made the Explorer on an automobile frame and not a truck frame. And they advertise, smoother, more comfortable, blah, blah. But the reason for doing it is to call it a car, so that they can more easily meet the requirements and so on. And they've also reclassified some small vehicles as trucks, so it helps average down. For instance, you all know what a PT Cruiser is, made by Chrysler. It's a little retro-designed vehicle, which is now classified as a truck, okay, for the purposes of meeting fuel requirements, because they managed to get the criteria changed such that any vehicle that had a flat cargo surface could be called a truck. And so you can fold seats down in the back of a PT Cruiser, and it's a truck, okay? And so gets good gas mileage, but it helps bring down the average so they can sell, a few more of the big Dodge Rams and so on without violating the average requirement. So that's the sort of regulation that also ought to be added to the burden of government. Now, the instance where I'm going to take exception with Friedman, and I'll come back to this in the fourth question, I think, is that taxes and budget deficits, yes, there are two ways of financing government spending, but it's certainly possible that one can be worse than the other. And I would say that in recent years, budget deficits are worse than taxes, especially when you have chronically large budget deficits. I'll make that case shortly. Chronically large budget deficits can be worse than taxes. Now, I make that point, from as a proposition in economics. In other words, given a certain level of government spending, you're probably better off not financing it with chronically large budget deficits. From a political point of view, the situation might well be quite different. I think it is quite different. It doesn't suggest, therefore, we ought to raise taxes to reduce the deficit, because raising taxes, as experience shows, probably will result in increased spending rather than reduced deficit. So there's a political angle that we don't want to neglect. Are all taxes dollar for dollar equally harmful? Well, no, of course not. And here I want to tell another story that illustrates this point. Ultimately, I'll argue that the least harmful, as far as just the economist is concerned, is looking at the efficiencies, is having the lowest rate, and to raise a given revenue, then you want the broadest base, maybe income as the base. A broad-based, low-rate income tax is probably less harmful than any narrower tax that raises a substantial revenue. One example I'll give of a very harmful tax that was eventually repealed by government precisely because it created harm in ways that it hadn't anticipated, was one advocated by George Bush, 41 Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. And Bush managed to enact a yacht tax. You remember this from the early 90s? The luxury tax. It applied to yachts, and it applied to luxury automobiles, which at the time were defined as any car costing more than $30,000. Well, okay, that in the early 90s maybe that was a luxury car. It's not anymore, but any car over $30,000, and especially yachts, and he emphasized the yachts. And it had broad broad political appeal. People loved it. Yes, we need a yacht tax. We want to tax people who can buy yachts. We think we know who they are. Okay, and taxing the wealthy that way is always something that's politically popular. Well, I'm happy to be able to say that even before the tax went into effect, I had an exam question on my micro exam. I was teaching micro back in those days. And I had given a lecture on the yacht tax, and so I asked the students to predict who would actually pay the yacht tax. Would it really be buyers of yachts? And the argument is that people who buy yachts have a lot of opportunities to buy, well, yachts or lots of other things. There are lots of choices that wealthy people can make. That's one of the benefits of being wealthy, I've heard. Okay, a lot of things to do with your money. Vacations on the Mediterranean, lots of other things to buy rather than buying yachts. And even though wealthy people can buy yachts, for most yacht buyers, the price of the yacht is a big ticket item, even for wealthy buyers, and certainly for the marginal yacht buyer, which means that the demand for yachts is pretty elastic. That if the tax goes on yachts, yacht sales go way down, and people just find other ways to spend their recreation dollar. All right. And that's what happened. Well, and if the demand for yachts collapsed, then communities that were heavily dependent on boatyards, and certainly employees of boatyards, were hit very heavily. So it turns out that the people who were hurt the most by the yacht tax was the worker in the boatyard who had a job, didn't pay all that much. I don't know how much you know about boatyards, but people who work there aren't necessarily all that wealthy. Okay? They're boatyard workers, all right? And boatyard workers lost their jobs or went to part-time or took reductions in pay and so on, all because of the yacht tax. And it took a while, but even the federal government eventually saw, they had to just see it, okay, they see what's happening, that the communities with boatyards are suffering mightily from the yacht tax. Meanwhile, the wealthy people are doing just fine, thank you. They've got a lot of things to spend their money on. And so eventually that tax was repealed. In general, the more narrowly you define the tax, in this case yachts, the more harmful it is, or at least the more dramatically harmful it is, the more it's obvious even to the politicians that it's a harmful tax. Now, I realize there might be some sympathy for making the tax base as narrow as possible, just to limit the total taxes that the government could take. Okay, I've heard proposals that the government should only be able to tax anchovies and raspberries. Okay, set the rate wherever you wanted, you know, and that would wreak havoc in those particular markets, but it would limit how much they could collect. But if you're interested in minimizing the distortions, then you go the other direction. You want the lowest rate, which you get with the broadest base, which would be, say, an income tax. And that's what I say there. I consider the yacht tax. The broader the base, the less distortion of economic activity. Of course, the trick is to keep the tax rate low. That's a political feat that's not often accomplished. And now I want to turn to this issue as, are taxes better or worse than budget deficits? And I'll admit up front that some taxes are. I mean, some taxes are so disruptive, maybe some of the ones we've already talked about, to cause more problems even than budget deficits. But when you're running large, chronically large budget deficits, I would say that the deficits are generally worse. And have an aside here that is worth thinking about before I get into the particular arguments, is that there's been a flip-flop in recent years about arguments that the apologists for the deficit make. There's been a flip-flop in who makes the apologies, for that matter. It used to be it was a sort of a left-leaning American liberal Democrat lefties that would say deficits are no problem because we owe it to ourselves. All right, that was I think that comes from Abba Lerner. We owe it to ourselves, implying that deficits are only a problem if we borrow from other countries. But as long as the debt is domestically held, it's really no problem. We owe it to ourselves. This is an argument that is in the category of proves too much. Murray Rothbard used to like this kind of an argument. It proves too much. If you buy that argument, it's also true that thievery is not a problem because we're only stealing from ourselves, and so on. So you suspect that, well, maybe it's still a problem, stealing and budget deficits. But in recent years, the arguments have been made not by people on the left, but people on the right, namely the supply-siders. They've become the biggest apologists for the debt. And the argument they make is precisely the opposite. It's deficits are no problem because we have access to world capital markets, which means we're borrowing it from other countries. And therefore it's not a problem. See, that doesn't follow either. They argue that as a percent of world saving, our borrowing is only a drop in the bucket. So don't worry about it. All right. Again, this is in the proves too much category, because if it were true, then we could abolish taxes totally and do nothing but borrowing, and that would be 6 drops in the bucket. You wouldn't much worry about that either, would you? So we'll see in a minute what the worries might be about, whether they're borrowing abroad or domestically. Given the political discussion about deficits, I feel obligated to deal with this question. Are the deficits actually very large? And only in the face of all of the political claims that they're small do we have to make the case that no, they're not small at all. They're pretty large. I want to sensitize you to the kinds of arguments that you hear in the press, here in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, about how the borrowing really isn't all that much. And the trick is to compare it to something that's much bigger. Okay? Almost anything appears small if you compare it to something that's sufficiently big. Okay? And the favorite thing to compare it to is gross domestic product. It used to be called gross national product. I think one of my old favorite politicians, Everett Dirksen, where was he from? Illinois. He said that he thought that the main function of the GNP statistic was to make everything else look small by comparison. And GDP, just to remind you of your macro, means essentially everything. Okay, the qualifications there, but it means essentially everything. And it's true that almost anything is small compared to everything. Okay, it just is. And so we could compare deficits to GDP, and it does seem pretty small, down in the single digits for sure. We could compare government borrowing to private borrowing. This should be a little worrisome, but that comparison gets made. In the private sector, there's a lot of borrowing going on too. And and government borrowing isn't all that big compared to private borrowing. Thirdly, comparing U.S. borrowing to the borrowing of other countries. They're borrowing a bunch too. Why single us out? And great on the curve. We're in the middle. Some countries have higher borrowing relative to their own GDPs and some less. Now, when you start talking about comparing it to other borrowing, it sort of leads you to a more reasonable comparison. In other words, if it's worrisome that the government is borrowing huge amounts of money, it's borrowing, what we should be comparing it to is not to how much other people or other countries are borrowing, but to how much is being saved for the purpose of borrowing. In other words, how much saving is there out there to borrow? And of course, in this country, savings is low and falling. And so if you compare borrowing to saving, then you get a pretty dramatic comparison. Government borrowed up to 60% or so of total private saving. I exclude corporate saving because corporations have their own things to do with their saving. But that's a huge ratio, and the only supply side retort to that is, oh, yes, but you're just looking at domestic saving, but there's saving around the world. In fact, Ben Bernanke says there's a glut of saving around the world, and we're just taking advantage of it. We're borrowing the saving, and so the supply siders want to look at world credit markets and saying that we can borrow even more, we could double our borrowing, it still drops in the bucket. It doesn't matter. And what they really mean is so far so good. No crisis has occurred yet from all of this borrowing. But there's some worry that our trading partners may decide to hold securities in euros instead of dollars, and that if that practice gets started, it may catch on to other countries if it happens in China or Japan or other countries. And if that were to happen, it would be a huge crisis for the U.S., a huge crisis for the Federal Reserve to try to deal with, and so on. The fact that it hasn't happened yet is not a reason not to worry. Okay. So what we should compare it to is saving, and that fraction is certainly going up. Now, let me give you an example how deficits can be worse than taxes. And the figures I'm using are simplified. They're a little lower than the actual figures, but I'm trying to keep the arithmetic simple. So let's have government spending pushing up against $3 trillion. I think it's cleared $3 trillion now, but 2.6 trillion in this example, and taxes 2.2 trillion. Well, the difference, of course, is the deficit. That's what we mean by the deficit of 400 billion, okay, in this example. Now, what I like to call people's attention to is however onerous taxes are, at least we have something called a tax code. And we can complain, rightly so, that it's inordinately complicated. And you have to hire accountants to figure out just what it is and what your tax liability is. It's a major undertaking each year to figure that out. But at least it's foreknown, it's written down. It changes too often, usually gets more complicated and so on. But there is something called a tax code. And so certainly business firms and even individuals have a general idea of what that tax code is. They plan for it, they hedge against it, they make their expenditures knowing what the tax implications will be. That's the whole purpose of the tax code, okay? And then the next expression I'm going to put on the screen is one you haven't heard before, mainly because there's no such thing as a deficit code. In other words, when the government borrows, it doesn't tell you at the time it borrows how it's going to finance that deficit, how it's going to deal with it in the future, what's going to happen as a result of that deficit. You don't know, and corporations don't know. And yet, what happens to that deficit and how it gets financed and refinanced in the years ahead may have a huge impact on corporations or on individuals for that matter. But there's no way to plan for it because you don't know what it's going to be. There's no way to hedge against it. It's just a black cloud of uncertainty out there that's faced by corporations. Let me give you some particulars, and I'll show you what I mean. One thing the government can do is borrow domestically. They've been kind of constrained on on that choice because people haven't been saving domestically. So not that much to borrow. But back when people saved in this country, that was one option. But of course, the other alternative is to borrow from the Federal Reserve. That gets done a lot. One option. I mean, the government might do that, might not. You don't know. And the third option is borrow abroad. In fact, that's what gives you a trade deficit if the government is borrowing extensively abroad. Now, let's look at the effects of those things. If you have borrowing domestically, that's going to give you high interest rates. In fact, it's called crowding out, if you look in the macro text. Crowding out. The government's borrowing, raising interest rates, making it prohibitive for private companies to borrow and undertake investments. If you borrow from the Fed, of course, that causes inflation because what they're lending is money created for the purpose. It's called monetizing the debt, and you get inflation. If you borrow abroad, then you get weak export markets because think about it. If the Japanese are arriving at our shores with ships full of automobiles and electronics and other hardware, they sell them here, and then instead of buying American goods to take back to Japan to put in their cargo compartment, they're buying treasury bills they put in their glove compartment, okay, and going back. Well, this can spell disaster for any firm that's in the export trade, that is not exporting anything in connection with those imports. So you get weak export markets. That's bad for planning purposes. How do you know how much to plan for export if you don't know how much the government is going to be borrowing abroad? The government tends to binge first on one of these alternatives and then the other. The way I've lined them up here, if you know the recent American history, borrowing domestically, creating a credit crunch, that was done by Nixon. We had a famous credit crunch in I think it was 1968, and it was eventually dealt with by Lyndon Johnson in a surtax, or by Nixon in a surtax. Inflation, that was the Carter administration who borrowed from the Fed and drove inflation up into the double digits. And weak export markets, that was Ronald Reagan who borrowed abroad and killed export markets in this country. If you look at the more recent administrations, they each did some combination of borrowing abroad and from the Fed, which is only to say that there wasn't much in the way of domestic savings for them to borrow. Now, one thing I found interesting is the studies that you can find in the journals. And in fact, there's even one article, I don't think I could give you the citation right now, but one article in the Southern Journal who has done a meta-study. They've sort of compiled and looked at all the other studies. And still, though, missed the point that I like to make in this lecture. And that the studies are done by economists that are looking at one particular way that deficits might affect the economy, say high interest rates. And they'll do a study, it's an empirical study, that's what gets done in the economics profession these days. Do an empirical study to see, once and for all, does government borrowing cause high interest rates? Do we see a correlation between government borrowing and high interest rates? Okay. And you might think that if they're economists, they should know some history too. And they should say, well, it certainly did during the Nixon administration. He borrowed domestically and drove up interest rates, gave us a credit crunch, had to be dealt with by surtax and so on. You could do that. Okay. But that's not what they do. They're basically econometricians. They're not economists/historians. They're economists/econometricians. And so they look at all the data they can get, which generally is from 1947. So it's just post-war, get beyond the war, where the war doesn't affect the data too much. 1947 to present. So you take all the data, 47 to present, and correlate it and see if generally over that whole time span, deficits and interest rates are highly correlated. And it turns out they're not. They're not. And they report the results. They said, do they? Well, no. It's weak and mixed. The results are weak and mixed. We can't say generally that deficits cause high interest. But there are other studies that, okay, it must cause something. Maybe it causes inflation. Now, they could have said, well, it certainly did during the Carter administration because the debt got monetized. The Fed created a bunch of money, drove up prices, and you got the inflation. But they're not historians, they're econometricians, so they look at all the data from 47 to present. Over that whole period, was it true that deficits are strongly correlated with inflation? Well, no. Because sometimes they were borrowing domestically, sometimes they were borrowing abroad. And so, can you guess what the results were? Weak and mixed. A whole other set of studies, this was during the Reagan administration, when the term twin deficits became very popular. That was the deficits in federal budget and international trade. But those things were moving together. And so that inspired economists to do a study. Well, is it generally true that there's a strong correlation between international trade deficits and budget deficits? They could have said, well, it certainly is during the Reagan administration because he's borrowing abroad, not domestically or from the Fed. But no, they're econometricians. They use all the data from 47 to present. All right, what do you think the results are? You get the pattern? Weak and mixed. Okay. Now, if you add up this, if you compile the studies, as one article or one economist did, some economists noticed all this. So let's do a survey because we can make a much more general statement. These individual economists are looking for particular effects, and they're all finding weak and mixed. So let's compile them and come up with a general principle. If you add up weak and mixed, what do you get? Don't worry, be happy. Okay? It doesn't cause anything, and you hear in the press that, you hear worse than that. You hear from Dick Cheney, who just says flatly, deficits don't matter. Okay, they don't matter. Pardon?
The Wall Street Journal.
The Wall Street Journal. Yeah, the deficits don't matter, and that's the basis for saying they don't matter because each possible cause is weak and mixed. And what I would argue is it matters precisely because you don't know what the particular effect will be. And if you're a chief executive officer and have to do some planning, then you have to know what to plan against. Are you planning on weak export markets? Are you planning on high interest rates? Are you planning on inflation? You don't know. There's no deficit code. You can't hedge against it. You're just exposed to that risk. And there's even a twist here that makes the situation compound itself. And then you tell me, what do investors do if they're sort of flummoxed about what to do in the market? They don't know what to buy or where to put their funds because whether they win or lose depends on these movements. And they don't know what they're going to be, so they better just set this one out and put their funds in something that's safe. What would that be? Treasury bills. Okay. Well, yeah, but you see, that's a point that needs to be dealt with, but I think I can deal with it. And so what happens is that, and get this, the reason the government's able to sell so many Treasury bills, okay, is that people are buying them to avoid the risks that have been created by the government's selling so many Treasury bills. I mean, it's sort of a double whammy. It keeps making itself worse. Now, it's true that one worry about the government being in debt is that eventually it will resort to inflation, okay, that it will monetize the debt and get inflation. But you're exposed to that risk whether you buy Treasury bills or not, okay? If you yourself abstain from buying Treasury bills on the grounds that debt tends to get inflated away at some point.
You could buy Swiss francs.
Oh yeah, you could do that, but a lot of people just buy Treasury bills, and the point is you can do that and be no more or less exposed to the inflation that might result from the government being in debt. So that inflation is not a risk that you that you take on by buying the Treasury bills. It's a risk that you face whether you buy the Treasury bills or not. So it's perverse in that sense too. A big deficit will lead to bigger deficits because people are hesitant to put their money in other places that would be risky, precisely because that black cloud is hanging over their heads. Okay. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes on the flat tax and then open it up for a few questions. Because the flat tax, Steve Forbes, Holden Rabushka wrote a book called The Flat Tax. Steve Forbes picked up on it and ran for president on the basis of the flat tax. And I think they're very fanciful in their ideas about how that could work or why it would work. And I've used the acronym, I don't know if you can pronounce it, it's a takeoff on 10 Staffel, you know that, from Robert Heinlein, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And mine is just a little different than that. There ain't no such thing as a big simple tax. And if you hear the flat taxers make the case, they say that simplicity is what we're going for. We have a big, complex tax, and we want to fix it by having a big, simple tax. Of course, the problem isn't the complex and the big, or the complex and the simple. The problem is the big, the big tax. You need to fix that and make it a small tax and equivalent small government spending. Murray Rothbard just was very favorable to all the complexities in the tax system. The more there are, the better chance you have of finding one that will save you some funds. Okay, he liked the complexity, you can see why. But my argument here is very compatible with his. It just says you ain't going to have a big simple tax. People aren't going to fill out a postcard size tax return. Here's my income, here's the percentage, here's what I owe, and then paper clip their check to the postcard and mail it. They're not going to do that. And it's sort of heartening to realize people won't fork over huge sums of money without a fight. And it turns out that if you institute this flat tax, it doesn't really make it simpler, it just changes the battleground. Right now, people are taxed largely on W-2 income. That's the basic tax. There are others too, the 1099s and different ways of reporting other incomes, but a huge portion of it is W-2. And people don't mind that. Okay, W-2, here's my W-2 income, but that's before I take all my deductions, okay, in the current system. So you have deduct, and that's what the battle is over, all these deductions, then you owe your tax on this lower sum. Well, Holden Rabushka and Steve Forbes want to eliminate all those deductions, eliminate deductions, and just have a flat tax. But to do that, it is to make the W-2 form of income unacceptable. In fact, even now, there's a movement towards contracting out and figuring ways to get your income in other than W-2 form. In other words, instead of working for the firm, you form your own firm and you contract to do services for the firm, and what you get paid is gross income, gross revenues, and then it's a matter of arguing about how much of those gross revenues are income. Well, you have to subtract your costs and so on. And so the whole battleground would just shift from what constitutes a deduction, which ones can you take, to what constitutes income. It would be just as complicated, actually more complicated, because what constitutes income could differ from one industry to another, one occupation to another, and so on. It would be a heyday for accountants, but it wouldn't be simpler. Okay. Now, what I argue is that if there's a case for a flat tax, it's all about political alliances. I mean, what the basic case for an honest-to-God flat tax is to give wealthy people and poor people something in common, both facing the same tax rate, and form an alliance between those groups, wealthy and poor, against the government. Okay? Unfortunately, the flat tax that was proposed by Steve Forbes had a huge exemption, not deduction, but exemption. It was $36,000. So the first $36,000 of income you make is not taxable. Only things after $36,000 are taxable. Now that blows the whole alliance scheme. In fact, it creates just the opposite alliance. Let me show you. Here's your elected officials, here's low-income taxpayers and high-income taxpayers. And Forbes' proposal was for a $36,000 exemption. That means if you make, well, even if you made, say, $46,000, you only owe taxes on $10,000. Okay? But take people who make $36,000, and that's pretty low income in today's economy. They're paying no taxes. And so any government services they get are free. They're not paying for it. Other people are paying for it. So they're going to be lobbying for more and more government services. And you're going to have an alliance between elected officials and low-income people against the high-income people, which is exactly what we'd be trying to get away from with any kind of meaningful tax reform. If we modify this proposal, see that with a $36,000 exemption, let's change that to a $36 exemption. I could have said no exemption, but I don't want to be perceived as radical. So $36 exemption. Then everybody has to pay the tax, low-income people and high-income people alike, and therefore you'd create an alliance between low-income taxpayers and high-income taxpayers against elected officials. Okay, so the whole goal, if there is a defensible goal of a flat tax, is precisely to create such an alliance. And it's blown by the Forbes proposal, or even by Hall and Rabushka. They wanted $25,000. And in fact, if you read that book, The Tax, or The Flat Tax, it's been published in 2 different editions. The Flat Tax, they say one a good feature of our flat tax is that it's progressive. I thought flat meant not progressive. But of course they say, well, there are really 2 marginal rates. There's 0 and then there's 25. You know, and so they advertise it as a progressive tax, but it just has one jump from at 36,000 or 25,000. Let me hold on just a minute. So for that reason, then I think at least the flat tax proposals that are actually made are not very attractive to people who are trying to constrain government. Let me stop here and take a couple of questions.
How about if you had a law that you couldn't vote unless you paid tax?
Well, I can.
Then that would change the politics.
Right, but of course no one's proposing that right now. But I think, or does someone propose that right now?
Well, I propose it.
You propose it, okay.
You don't pay taxes. If you're a stockholder, if you don't hold stock, you don't get to vote.
That's
For
right.
the company, and so why not? If you're a non-payer of taxes, why should you be allowed to vote? Nobody would vote. I don't know.
Figure out how to be a non-voter and.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I certainly see the virtue in that. I was trying to look at the proposals that are actually on the table. Anybody else? Yeah.
Back to the question of taxes versus deficits, which is worse. The case you were making, at least as I understood it, was really more a comparison of larger versus smaller deficits. But the problems of deficits that we're talking about are problems of large deficits.
Right.
If you reduce the deficit by reducing expenditures, then you're better off.
Right.
Here will agree with that.
Right.
But if you're really comparing, say you decided that you're going to spend this amount of money, is it better to finance it with taxes or deficits? How do you address the Ricardian equivalence argument that basically, as long as people are reasonably far-sighted and they realize that this debt has to be repaid with future taxes, that it really makes no difference whether you finance a given level of expenditure with taxes or deficits?
Well, even Ricardo recognized they're not equivalent. I mean, there's a sense, just an accounting sense, a present value reckoning that makes them equivalent. All right, But once Ricardo pointed that out, and it's certainly true that if you don't see that, then we need to work on you to get you to see it. There's a present value equivalence. But Ricardo's whole point is that once you've seen that, then let's talk about the differences, okay? And the differences are pretty much, suggest that the taxes would be preferable. In other words, people don't save more just because they think that the taxes are going to be higher in the future. In fact, they're not quite sure that their taxes will be higher. They hope maybe other people will have to pay the taxes. And empirically, it certainly isn't borne out that the savings rate doesn't go up with increased deficits. It just doesn't happen, okay? And if it did, there would be less to worry about, okay? Why worry about the deficit? We don't, because we see all these people saving up to pay the higher tax bill. But you don't see that. They're not saving up, all right? So the people themselves don't consider it similar.
The answer is basically people are not that far.
Well, it's not a question. It's not a question of being farsighted. It's a question of maybe not incurring the tax liability themselves. All they can predict is that the government will have to get some more taxes somehow, somewhere. Okay, but maybe they'll pass a yacht tax or something. Who knows? And I won't buy a yacht, and I won't work at the boatyard. So it's not just lack of foresight, I don't think. Okay, we're out of time, but thank you much.